I came home from a 3-week cattle drive to find a bright orange traffic cone sitting dead center in my driveway. A laminated sign attached reading, "Unauthorized Vehicle Access Prohibited by OA Regulation 847B." And standing behind it like some sort of suburban general was Patricia Thornfield, clipboard in one hand, phone recording in the other, smiling at me like she'd just won the lottery. She'd been planning this ambush for months, collecting violations I never knew existed, building a case that would either force me off my own land or hand her the victory she'd been craving since the day I refused to join her precious homeowners association. But what Patricia didn't know was that I'd spent 15 years as a federal land management investigator, and I was about to turn her own rulebook into the weapon that would end her reign of terror forever. The first thing you need to understand about Patricia Thornfield is that she wasn't born evil. She was made that way by 20 years of middle management disappointments and a divorce that left her with nothing but a condo in Pine Creek Estates and an insatiable hunger for control over anyone within a 5-mile radius of her perfectly manicured lawn. At 52, she'd transformed from a failed insurance adjuster into the self-appointed queen of our rural community, wielding HOA bylaws like a sword and neighborhood complaints like a shield, all while wearing the kind of smile that made children hide behind their mothers and grown men suddenly remember urgent appointments elsewhere. Her war against me started 6 months ago when I bought the 180-acre Morrison Ranch, a beautiful spread of rolling hills and creek bottom that happened to border the northern edge of Pine Creek Estates, and more importantly, happened to include the only road access to the hiking trail that her precious community had been using for free for the past decade. The Morrison Ranch had been in foreclosure for 2 years before I found it, abandoned by a family that couldn't handle the mortgage payments after the patriarch died in a farming accident, and I'd gotten it for less than half its appraised value because nobody else wanted to deal with the complications that came with land bordered by an HOA community that thought it owned everything it could see from their back patios. I'm Ryan Fletcher, and I'd spent most of my adult life working for the Bureau of Land Management, investigating everything from illegal mining operations to fraudulent grazing permits, which meant I knew exactly how to research property boundaries, verify legal documents, and spot the kind of bureaucratic shenanigans that people like Patricia used to intimidate folks who didn't know any better. After 15 years of dealing with corporate ranchers who thought they could buy their way out of federal regulations and environmental groups, who thought they could sue their way into changing century-old land patents, handling one middle-aged HOA president with delusions of grandeur seemed like it would be a vacation. I was wrong about the vacation part, but I was absolutely right about knowing how to handle her type of bureaucratic bullying, and it all started with that orange cone in my driveway and Patricia's smug expression as she stood there like she was conducting some kind of official government business instead of trespassing on private property with fake authority, and a clipboard full of made-up regulations. The sign attached to the cone was a masterpiece of official-looking nonsense, complete with embossed letterhead that read Pine Creek Estates Community Standards Enforcement Division and language that would have impressed a federal prosecutor if any of it had been legally binding, which it absolutely was not, because Patricia had made the critical error of assuming that property ownership was somehow subject to the opinions of people who lived nearby. "Mr. Fletcher," she announced as I climbed out of my truck, her voice carrying that particular combination of false authority and genuine excitement that people get when they think they're about to destroy someone's life. "You've been operating an unauthorized access route through protected community space for the past 6 months, and effective immediately. This violation must be remediated through proper channels." She held up her phone to make sure she was recording my reaction, probably expecting me to get angry or confused or beg her to explain what she was talking about. But instead I just looked at the cone, looked at her sign, looked at her satisfied expression, and started laughing because I'd seen this exact same routine from developers who thought they could claim federal land by posting enough official-looking signs and hoping nobody would check their paperwork. The driveway she was blocking had been in continuous use since 1987. According to the title documents I'd reviewed before buying the property, and it had been legally established as the primary access route to the Morrison Ranch through a properly filed easement that was recorded with the county clerk's office and referenced in every property deed for the past 35 years. More importantly, the driveway was entirely on my property, running from the county road through my front gate to my house without crossing so much as an inch of Pine Creek Estates land, which meant Patricia was essentially trying to block my access to my own home, using authority she didn't possess to enforce regulations that didn't exist. But I didn't explain any of that to her right away because I wanted to see exactly how far she'd go with this performance before I pulled the rug out from under her entire operation. "That's interesting. Patricia," I said, walking over to examine her cone and sign more closely while she followed me with her phone camera, clearly expecting some kind of dramatic confrontation that would make great evidence for whatever lawsuit she was planning. "Could you show me exactly where this community space is that you're talking about? Because according to my survey maps, this driveway runs entirely through private property that I own free and clear." Her smile flickered for just a moment before she recovered and launched into what was obviously a prepared speech about community standards and property value protection and the legal authority of homeowners associations to regulate traffic patterns that affected the peaceful enjoyment of their members' homes. The speech would have been impressive if any of it had been true, but having spent 15 years listening to similar speeches from people who thought they could intimidate federal investigators with complex-sounding legal theories and official-looking documents, I recognized every word of it as the kind of bureaucratic nonsense that people use when they're hoping you won't actually check their facts. Patricia had obviously spent considerable time researching HOA regulations and property law, but she'd made the fundamental error of assuming that wanting something to be true was the same as making it legally binding. And she was about to learn the difference between actual authority and the kind of pretend authority that works only on people who don't know any better. "I appreciate the explanation," I told her, pulling out my own phone to start recording this conversation for my own files. "But I'm going to need to see some documentation of this community space you're referring to. And I'm also going to need you to move that cone so I can access my own property." Her expression shifted from confidence to irritation as she realized I wasn't going to be intimidated by her official-sounding speech. And she started explaining that the documentation was available through proper channels, but that immediate compliance was required regardless of my personal opinions about community standards. That's when I knew for certain that Patricia had crossed the line from annoying neighbor to someone who was about to face the kind of legal consequences that come from interfering with other people's property rights using fake authority and fraudulent documentation. I'd seen the same pattern dozens of times in my federal career, usually involving people who thought they could claim mineral rights or grazing permits by creating official-looking documents and hoping nobody would verify their legitimacy with the actual authorities. And it always ended the same way when someone with real legal knowledge finally got involved. "Patricia," I said, keeping my voice calm and professional the way I'd learned to do when dealing with people who were about to be arrested for federal crimes. "I'm going to ask you one more time to remove that cone and leave my property. If you refuse, I'm going to call the sheriff's department and report you for trespassing and interference with property access. And then I'm going to file a formal complaint with the district attorney's office about fraudulent use of official-sounding documents to intimidate property owners." Her face went pale for a moment before the anger kicked in, and she started yelling about how I couldn't threaten her for enforcing legitimate community standards, and how she had every right to protect her neighborhood from people who thought they were above the rules that everyone else had to follow. The yelling was a mistake because it attracted the attention of my nearest neighbor, Ben Crawford, who lived about half a mile south and had been dealing with Patricia's harassment for the past 2 years, ever since she decided his barn was an eyesore that violated some imaginary architectural standard she'd invented for the area. Ben walked over with his own phone camera running and asked if everything was okay, which gave me the opportunity to explain that Patricia was blocking my driveway with unauthorized traffic control devices and claiming authority she didn't possess over property she didn't own. Ben started laughing when he heard Patricia's explanation about community standards and HOA regulations. And he told me that she'd been pulling the same routine with half the property owners in the area, sending official-looking letters about violations and fines and threatening legal action if people didn't comply with her made-up rules. She sent me a bill for $300 last month, Ben explained, claiming my barn violated community aesthetic standards and demanding immediate payment or legal action. When I told her to take me to court, she started calling the county building department, trying to get them to condemn my property for code violations. That's when I realized Patricia's operation was much bigger than just harassing me about my driveway. And I started thinking about the kind of federal investigation that might be warranted when someone was systematically defrauding property owners using fake authority and fraudulent documentation to collect money and control behavior. In my BLM career, I'd worked on cases involving everything from fake mining claims to fraudulent environmental permits, and Patricia's operation had all the hallmarks of the kind of bureaucratic fraud that federal prosecutors loved to pursue, because it was easy to prove and usually involved multiple victims who were eager to testify. Ben, I said, how many other people in the area have received these official-looking letters from Patricia's Community Standards Enforcement Division? His answer was exactly what I expected and exactly what I needed to turn this from a simple trespassing complaint into something much more serious. According to Ben, Patricia had been systematically targeting every property owner within a 3-mile radius of Pine Creek Estates, sending them demands for compliance with various regulations that sounded official but weren't actually enforceable by anyone, and collecting thousands of dollars in fake fines from people who were too intimidated or confused to challenge her authority. The pattern was classic bureaucratic fraud, the kind of operation that starts small with 1 or 2 victims and gradually expands as the perpetrator gets more confident and more greedy, and it usually continues until someone with actual legal knowledge gets involved and starts asking the kind of questions that expose the entire scheme. I'd seen similar operations involving fake environmental permits, fraudulent grazing licenses, and phony mineral rights claims, and they all followed the same trajectory from small-scale intimidation to large-scale fraud to eventual federal prosecution when someone finally reported them to the proper authorities. Patricia, I said, turning back to face her directly, while both Ben and I continued recording the conversation, I think we need to have a serious discussion about the legal implications of what you're doing here. You're claiming authority you don't possess, using fraudulent documentation to intimidate property owners, and apparently collecting money through false pretenses from people who don't know enough about property law to challenge your claims. Those are serious criminal offenses, and if you don't want to face federal charges for mail fraud and conspiracy to defraud property owners, I suggest you remove that cone and start thinking about how you're going to explain your activities to a federal prosecutor. Her reaction was immediate and predictable. A combination of outrage at being challenged and panic at the realization that someone with actual legal knowledge was finally calling her bluff, and she started threatening to call the police and report me for harassment and intimidation of a community official who was just trying to protect neighborhood property values from people who refused to follow reasonable standards. The threats would have been more impressive if any of them had been based on actual laws instead of Patricia's imagination. But they did serve the useful purpose of getting her to admit on camera that she considered herself a community official with authority to enforce standards on people who lived outside her HOA jurisdiction. That's very interesting, I told her, making sure my phone was capturing every word of her admission. Could you explain exactly what authority you believe you have to enforce standards on property owners who never signed HOA agreements and don't live within your community boundaries? Because I'm pretty sure that kind of authority requires actual legal authorization from legitimate government agencies, not just a clipboard and some homemade signs. Her answer was a masterpiece of circular logic and legal gibberish that would have made a sovereign citizen proud, involving theories about community impact zones and property value protection districts and the inherent authority of concerned citizens to protect their investments from neighbors who refuse to maintain appropriate standards. None of it made any legal sense. But all of it was being recorded by multiple cameras, which meant Patricia was creating exactly the kind of evidence that federal prosecutors love to use in fraud cases, where the defendant has helpfully documented their own criminal intent and fraudulent claims of authority. I'd worked on dozens of cases where the primary evidence came from the perpetrator's own statements and documents, and Patricia was building a stronger case against herself than any prosecutor could have hoped for. "I'm going to make you a one-time offer," I told her, keeping my voice calm and professional despite the absurdity of the situation. "You can remove that cone, stop harassing property owners with fake authority and fraudulent documents, and refund any money you've collected through false pretenses. If you do that, I'll consider this a misunderstanding and won't file federal charges for mail fraud and conspiracy to defraud. If you refuse, I'm going to contact the FBI field office in Denver and request a formal investigation into your activities, and I'm going to help them build a case that will result in your prosecution for multiple federal crimes." The offer was more generous than she deserved, but I've always believed in giving people one chance to stop digging before they hit rock bottom, and I wanted to see if Patricia was smart enough to recognize when she was facing someone who actually knew how the legal system worked. Her response was to double down on her claims of authority and start threatening to have me arrested for interfering with official community business, which told me everything I needed to know about her intelligence level and her likelihood of accepting reasonable solutions to the problems she'd created for herself. "Okay," I said, putting my phone away and walking back toward my truck. "I gave you a chance to resolve this quietly, but you've made it clear that you'd rather face federal prosecution than admit you're wrong. I'm going to move that cone so I can access my own property, and then I'm going to start making some phone calls that are going to change your life in ways you probably haven't considered." Patricia started yelling about how I couldn't touch her official traffic control devices and how she was going to have me arrested for destroying community property. But I ignored her and simply picked up the cone and moved it to the side of the road where it belonged. The cone was plastic and weighed about 2 pounds, which made Patricia's claims about official traffic control devices even more ridiculous than they already were. And when I examined her laminated sign more closely, I found exactly what I expected to find. No legitimate authority markings, no government agency references that could be verified, and language that was designed to sound official while being completely meaningless from a legal perspective. It was the kind of document that worked only on people who didn't know enough about administrative law to recognize bureaucratic gibberish when they saw it. "Ben," I called to my neighbor, who was still recording everything with obvious enjoyment, "would you mind staying here for a few minutes to make sure Patricia doesn't put that cone back in my driveway while I make some phone calls? I'd hate for her to add trespassing and vandalism to the list of charges she's already facing." Ben agreed enthusiastically, and I could see Patricia starting to realize that her carefully planned ambush had turned into a public humiliation that was being documented by multiple cameras and witnessed by people who were definitely not intimidated by her fake authority. I drove up to my house and immediately called my former supervisor at the BLM Denver field office, explained the situation, and asked him to connect me with someone in the FBI's white-collar crime division who specialized in mail fraud and conspiracy cases. Within 20 minutes, I was talking to Special Agent Sarah Martinez, who listened to my description of Patricia's activities with the kind of professional interest that told me she'd handled similar cases and knew exactly how to proceed with an investigation. "Mister, Fletcher, Agent Martinez said after I'd finished explaining the pattern of fraudulent letters, fake fines, and claims of non-existent authority. What you're describing sounds like a classic mail fraud operation that's probably been expanding over time as the perpetrator gets more confident. How many victims do you estimate might be involved? And do you have documentation of the fraudulent claims? I told her that Ben Crawford had mentioned at least a dozen property owners in the immediate area, and that I suspected the actual number was much higher because Patricia had been operating for at least 2 years without anyone challenging her authority. I can have someone there tomorrow to start collecting evidence, Agent Martinez explained. But it would be helpful if you could document tonight's incident and gather any other evidence you might have access to. These cases are usually easier to prosecute when we can show a pattern of fraudulent activity over time. And it sounds like this woman has been creating plenty of evidence of her own criminal intent. I assured her that I had multiple camera recordings of tonight's confrontation, including Patricia's own admission that she considered herself a community official with authority to enforce standards on property owners outside her jurisdiction. The conversation with Agent Martinez lasted about 15 minutes, and by the time I hung up, I could see through my front window that Patricia was still standing in my driveway arguing with Ben Crawford, who appeared to be enjoying himself immensely while explaining to her exactly why her claims of authority were legally meaningless. I decided to let them continue their discussion while I researched Pine Creek Estates HOA documents and gathered the kind of background information that would help federal investigators understand the scope of Patricia's fraudulent activities. The Pine Creek Estates HOA had been established in 2018 when the development was built, and according to the publicly available documents filed with the county clerk's office, it had jurisdiction only over the properties within the development boundaries that had signed specific HOA agreements as part of their purchase contracts. The HOA's actual authority was limited to enforcing architectural standards and maintenance requirements for properties within the development, and it had absolutely no legal authority to regulate or fine property owners outside the development boundaries. More importantly, Patricia's title as Community Standards Enforcement Director appeared nowhere in the official HOA documents, which meant she had invented both the position and the authority that came with it, probably because the actual HOA board wasn't willing to support her harassment of outside property owners, and she decided to create her own fake authority structure to pursue her personal vendettas. It was exactly the kind of fraudulent scheme that federal prosecutors love to pursue because the legal issues were clear-cut and the evidence was usually abundant. I spent the next hour researching property records and HOA filings, and by the time I finished, I had a complete picture of Patricia's operation that would have impressed a federal prosecutor with its scope and audacity. She had been systematically targeting property owners throughout the area with fraudulent claims of authority, collecting thousands of dollars in fake fines, and creating an elaborate, bureaucratic structure that existed only in her imagination and on her homemade documents. When I walked back outside, Patricia was gone, and Ben was sitting on my front porch with a beer, grinning like he'd just watched the best entertainment he'd seen in years. She finally left about 10 minutes ago, he told me, but not before threatening to have both of us arrested for interfering with official community business and destroying public property. I think she really believes she has some kind of legitimate authority over all of us. That's what makes this a federal crime instead of just a civil dispute, I explained. If she knew she was lying about her authority, it would be simple fraud. But because she actually believes her own lies, it becomes conspiracy to defraud, which carries much heavier penalties and attracts federal attention because it usually involves multiple victims across state lines. Ben raised an eyebrow and asked if I really thought Patricia's operation was big enough to interest federal prosecutors, and I told him that Agent Martinez had seemed very interested in the case and was sending someone out tomorrow to start collecting evidence. The thing about people like Patricia, I continued, is that they usually start small and gradually expand their operations as they get more confident and more greedy. I suspect she's been targeting property owners all over this part of the county, and probably collecting tens of thousands of dollars in fake fines from people who were too intimidated to challenge her authority. That's exactly the kind of case that federal prosecutors love, because it's easy to prove and usually involves sympathetic victims who were defrauded by someone claiming false authority. Ben nodded thoughtfully and then asked the question I'd been expecting. So what happens to Patricia when the FBI finishes their investigation? I explained that mail fraud and conspiracy to defraud were serious federal crimes that usually resulted in significant prison time, especially when the perpetrator had been operating for an extended period and had defrauded multiple victims. She's probably looking at 5 to 10 years in federal prison, I told him, plus restitution to all her victims and forfeiture of any property or assets she acquired through fraudulent means. The next morning, Special Agent Martinez arrived at my ranch with a forensic accountant and a document specialist, and we spent 3 hours reviewing everything I'd collected about Patricia's operation, including the recordings from the previous night's confrontation and the research I'd done on HOA authority and property law. Agent Martinez was particularly interested in Patricia's admission that she considered herself a community official with authority to enforce standards outside her jurisdiction, because it demonstrated criminal intent and knowledge that her claims were fraudulent. This is exactly the kind of case we see with increasing frequency. Agent Martinez explained, someone with no actual authority creates an official-sounding organization, issues fraudulent documents that look legitimate to people who don't know better, and gradually expands their operation until they're defrauding dozens or hundreds of victims. The pattern is always the same. They start with small claims and modest fines, and when nobody challenges them, they get bolder and greedier until they're running what amounts to a criminal enterprise. The forensic accountant was particularly interested in Ben's information about other property owners who had received Patricia's fraudulent letters and paid her fake fines, because tracking the money flow would help establish the scope of the conspiracy and provide evidence of criminal intent. We'll need to interview all the victims we can identify, she explained, and document every fraudulent letter, fake fine, and false claim of authority. These cases are usually built on volume of evidence rather than complexity of legal theory. By noon, Agent Martinez had enough information to request a federal search warrant for Patricia's home and business records, and she explained that the investigation would probably take several months to complete because they would need to identify and interview all the victims, trace the financial transactions, and document the full scope of the fraudulent scheme. But based on what you've shown us today, she told me, I'm confident we can build a strong case for multiple federal charges, including mail fraud, conspiracy to defraud, and possibly RICO violations. If we can prove this was an ongoing criminal enterprise. The search warrant was executed 2 days later, and according to Ben Crawford, who watched the FBI agents carry boxes of documents out of Patricia's condo, she was arrested on the spot and charged with multiple federal crimes. The local newspaper ran a story about the arrest with the headline, "Local Woman Charged with Defrauding Property Owners." And within a week, I started receiving phone calls from other victims who wanted to know how to get their money back and whether they could file civil lawsuits in addition to cooperating with the federal prosecution. The investigation ultimately identified 47 victims who had paid Patricia a total of $127,000 in fake fines over a 2-year period, and the federal grand jury indicted her on 23 counts of mail fraud, 15 counts of conspiracy to defraud, and 3 counts of racketeering under the RICO Act. Her trial was scheduled for the following spring, and according to Agent Martinez, the prosecution was confident they could prove that Patricia had been operating a criminal enterprise designed to defraud property owners through false claims of authority and fraudulent documentation. Patricia's attorney tried to negotiate a plea bargain that would have resulted in probation and restitution. But the federal prosecutor rejected the offer because the scope of the fraud and the number of victims warranted significant prison time as both punishment and deterrence for similar schemes. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, the prosecutor explained in court documents. This was a systematic criminal enterprise that operated for years and defrauded dozens of victims through elaborate lies and fraudulent claims of authority. The trial lasted 2 weeks, and I testified about my background in federal land management. The events of the night Patricia blocked my driveway, and the research I'd done that helped expose the fraudulent nature of her operation. The prosecution played the recorded conversation where Patricia admitted she considered herself a community official with authority over property owners outside her jurisdiction, and the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Patricia was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation, and ordered to pay full restitution to all identified victims, plus forfeit her condo and all assets acquired through fraudulent means. The judge specifically noted that the sentence was intended to send a message to other people who might consider using false claims of authority to defraud property owners, and that the court would not tolerate criminal enterprises that targeted vulnerable citizens with bureaucratic intimidation and fake documentation. 6 months after Patricia's sentencing, I received a check for $3,200 as my share of the restitution payments, even though I had never paid any of her fake fines. Agent Martinez explained that the federal government had calculated damages based on the harassment and property interference I had suffered, and that all victims were entitled to compensation, regardless of whether they had actually paid money to Patricia's fraudulent operation. The best part of the whole experience, though, was the effect it had on the other property owners in the area who had been intimidated by Patricia's fake authority for years. Ben Crawford organized a neighborhood barbecue to celebrate her conviction, and more than 30 people showed up to share stories about the fraudulent letters they'd received and the relief they felt knowing they would never have to deal with her harassment again. "You know what the funniest part is?" Ben asked me as we watched kids playing in his supposedly non-compliant barn while their parents enjoyed the first peaceful gathering the neighborhood had seen in years. Patricia spent all that time trying to control everyone else's property, and now she doesn't own any property at all because the federal government seized everything she had to pay restitution to her victims. I agreed that there was a certain poetic justice in the outcome. But what really satisfied me was knowing that 47 people who had been defrauded and intimidated by someone claiming false authority had received justice and compensation for what they'd suffered. Patricia's operation had been exactly the kind of bureaucratic fraud I'd spent my federal career investigating, and using that experience to expose her crimes and protect her victims felt like the perfect capstone to my law enforcement career. The orange cone that started it all was still in my garage, where I'd put it as evidence for the federal investigation, and Agent Martinez told me I could keep it as a souvenir after the trial was over. Sometimes I look at it and remember the satisfaction I felt when Patricia's fake authority crumbled under the weight of real legal knowledge and federal prosecution. And I think about how many other people might be out there running similar scams because they're counting on their victims not knowing enough about the law to challenge their fraudulent claims. But mostly I just enjoy the peace and quiet of my ranch, where the only traffic control devices are the ones I put up myself, and the only community standards that matter are the ones that come from being a good neighbor instead of a bureaucratic bully with a clipboard and a badge. That means nothing to anyone who knows what real authority looks like. The real transformation in our community didn't happen overnight, but it started almost immediately after Patricia's conviction, when people began talking openly about the harassment they'd endured and the fear they'd lived with for years without realizing they weren't alone in their suffering. Maria Gonzalez, who owned a small horse ranch about 2 miles east of my property, told me that Patricia had been sending her letters for 18 months, claiming that her horses violated community noise ordinances and demanding monthly fees for livestock impact mitigation, even though Maria's property was outside any HOA jurisdiction and her nearest neighbor was half a mile away. I paid her almost $4,000. Maria explained during one of our neighborhood gatherings, because I was afraid she would call immigration services or animal control if I didn't comply with her demands. She knew I was scared of dealing with government agencies, and she used that fear against me. Maria's story was heartbreaking, but not unique. And as more victims came forward, we began to understand that Patricia had been deliberately targeting people she perceived as vulnerable or unlikely to challenge her authority. The elderly couple who lived on Sunset Ridge Road had paid Patricia over $6,000 in fake fines for various infractions, including inappropriate mailbox height, non-compliant driveway materials, and excessive tree coverage, blocking community sightlines. When I visited them to explain that none of those regulations existed and that Patricia had been convicted of fraud, the wife broke down, crying with relief, and the husband admitted he'd been considering selling their home because he couldn't afford to keep paying Patricia's escalating demands. Agent Martinez told me that Patricia's targeting strategy was classic predatory behavior, focusing on elderly residents, non-English speakers, and people who seemed intimidated by official-sounding documents or afraid of legal complications. She was essentially running a protection racket. Agent Martinez explained, using fake authority and fraudulent documentation to extort money from people who didn't know they had the right to tell her to go to hell. The federal investigation also uncovered evidence that Patricia had been planning to expand her operation beyond individual property owners and start targeting small businesses in the area with claims about commercial vehicle restrictions, signage violations, and customer traffic impact on residential communities. Her computer files contained draft letters to local contractors, landscaping companies, and even the rural mail carrier, demanding compliance with various made-up regulations and threatening legal action for non-compliance. She was building toward a much larger criminal enterprise. The federal prosecutor explained during a victim impact hearing 6 months after the trial, if Mr. Fletcher hadn't challenged her authority and exposed her fraudulent claims, she probably would have expanded her operation to include dozens of additional businesses and possibly hundreds of additional victims throughout the county. The prosecutor's assessment was supported by documents seized from Patricia's home that showed she had been researching property records throughout a 50-mile radius, identifying potential targets based on property values, owner demographics, and proximity to any kind of development that could provide justification for her fake community standards. She had even created a spreadsheet tracking her victims' payment histories and rating their likelihood of compliance with future demands. One of the most disturbing discoveries was Patricia's correspondence with someone identified only as Associate K, who appeared to be running a similar operation in another part of the state. The letters discuss strategies for intimidating property owners, techniques for creating official-looking documents, and methods for avoiding detection by legitimate authorities. Agent Martinez told me that this correspondence had triggered a multi-state investigation into what appeared to be a network of people running similar fraudulent schemes in rural communities across the western United States. Your case opened up something much bigger than we initially realized. Agent Martinez explained during one of our follow-up conversations, we've identified at least 6 other people in 4 different states who appear to be running variations of the same scam, all using similar tactics and documentation. It's possible that Patricia was part of an organized network that shared information and techniques for defrauding property owners. The expanded investigation led to additional arrests and prosecutions, and I found myself testifying not just in Patricia's case but in federal trials in Montana, Wyoming, and Utah, where other operators had been using similar tactics to defraud rural property owners. In each case, the pattern was identical. Someone with no legitimate authority would create an official-sounding organization, target vulnerable property owners with fraudulent claims and fake fines, and gradually expand their operation until someone with actual legal knowledge exposed their crimes. My experience with Patricia also led to an unexpected second career as a consultant for federal investigators and rural property owners dealing with similar schemes. Agent Martinez recommended me to other FBI field offices that were investigating bureaucratic fraud cases, and I found myself traveling throughout the western states, helping expose fake authority operations and teaching property owners how to recognize and challenge fraudulent claims. The work was satisfying in a way that reminded me of my best days with the Bureau of Land Management, when I could use my knowledge and experience to protect ordinary people from criminals who thought they could hide behind fake authority and fraudulent documentation. Each case was different in its details, but identical in its basic structure, and I learned that people like Patricia were far more common than I had realized. In Colorado alone, we identified 17 different individuals who had been running variations of Patricia's scheme, targeting everyone from ranch owners to small business operators with fake fines and fraudulent claims of regulatory authority. Some focused on environmental violations, others on zoning compliance, and a few specialized in historical preservation requirements. But all of them used the same basic strategy of intimidating people with official-sounding documents and hoping their victims wouldn't know enough about the law to challenge their claims. The consulting work also put me in contact with legitimate government agencies that were dealing with the fallout from these fraudulent operations, including county clerks who had been receiving complaints about fake regulations, building departments that had been contacted by confused property owners trying to verify non-existent requirements, and sheriff's departments that had been called to investigate disputes between fraud victims and their tormentors. These fake authority schemes are becoming a real problem, explained Sheriff Janet Morrison during a multi-agency meeting about bureaucratic fraud prevention. We're getting calls almost daily from property owners who have received official-looking letters demanding compliance with regulations that don't exist. And most of our deputies don't have the specialized knowledge needed to determine what's legitimate and what's fraudulent. The meeting led to the development of a training program for rural law enforcement officers that taught them how to recognize common patterns in bureaucratic fraud and how to connect victims with federal investigators who specialized in these cases. I helped design the curriculum based on my experience with Patricia's operation and the patterns I'd observed in similar cases throughout the region. The training program was eventually adopted by law enforcement agencies in 12 states, and I received regular updates about cases where officers had used the training to identify fraudulent authority schemes and protect potential victims from financial and emotional harm. Each success story reminded me that Patricia's attempt to steal my ranch and intimidate my neighbors had ultimately led to something positive that protected thousands of other people from similar crimes. But the most rewarding aspect of the whole experience was seeing how our local community had transformed in the years following Patricia's conviction. Without the constant threat of her harassment and fraudulent fines, property owners began investing in improvements and expansions they had been afraid to undertake when she was claiming authority over their decisions. Maria Gonzalez expanded her horse training operation. The elderly couple on Sunset Ridge Road built the deck they had wanted for years, and Ben Crawford finally painted his barn the color he preferred, instead of the community-appropriate shade Patricia had demanded. The neighborhood gatherings that Ben had started as a celebration of Patricia's conviction evolved into regular social events that brought together property owners from throughout the area, creating the kind of genuine community that Patricia had claimed to be protecting but had actually been destroying through her harassment and intimidation. People who had been afraid to make eye contact with their neighbors for fear of attracting Patricia's attention now worked together on projects like road maintenance, fire prevention, and emergency preparedness. You know what's funny? Ben asked me during one of our regular barbecues. As we watched kids playing games, that would have been impossible when Patricia was issuing noise violation citations for any sound louder than a whisper. She spent all that time talking about community standards and property values, but the real community only started when she was gone. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who had lived through Patricia's reign of terror. Her fraudulent claims about protecting property values had actually been damaging them, while her elimination had led to exactly the kind of community improvement and property value enhancement she had claimed to be pursuing. It was a perfect example of how fake authority often produces results that are exactly opposite to what legitimate authority would achieve. I still live on the Morrison Ranch, and I still get occasional calls from federal investigators who want to consult with me about bureaucratic fraud cases. But mostly I enjoy the peace and quiet that comes from living in a community where people treat each other with respect, instead of trying to control each other through intimidation and fake authority. The orange cone that started my confrontation with Patricia is still in my garage, serving as a reminder that sometimes the best way to deal with bullies is to call their bluff and let them destroy themselves with their own lies and criminal behavior.